Hello and welcome to the One Drink Book Club. Today we're discussing The Last Kings of Shanghai by journalist Jonathan Kaufman. The book tells the story of two rival Jewish dynasties that helped create modern China. My guest tonight is Tim Rice, a friend and associate editor of the Free Beacon. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks for having me, Jamey.
Of course. So this was a great suggestion. You made the suggestion on the book, and I loved it. And it's a fascinating story, one that I didn't know anything about. I had no idea. How did you hear about the book? What made you try this?
Yeah, that's actually a funny story too. So it's sort of outside my wheelhouse. I know shamefully little about China, and every time I try to correct that, I wind up reading a couple of journal articles and kind of petering off and just sticking to reading the news, the stuff that we cover. But my best friend Eric, in March, I went to visit him in New York, and he gave me a copy of it. He said, "Here, take this home. I think you'll love it." And it somehow made its way to the bin of papers and laptop chargers under my coffee table that, where things go to die. And months later, I was digging through it looking for some chord or another. And I found the book kind of right at the stages of getting bent and thought, oh, this looks cool. I didn't even really process what it was about. And so I sat down to read it that night. And I'm a painfully slow reader. I read it in 2 nights. Like, I sped through it. I couldn't get enough. I also knew nothing about this. I think no one knows this story, which is sort of why Kaufman wrote the book, and what's so fascinating about it is that this was two such influential families, both in Shanghai and around the world. But yeah, that's how it came to me.
I don't gravitate towards nonfiction. I do like some of the spy novels where you're talking about real life espionage issues and some of the World War II stuff. But this really read like a novel. And clearly Kaufman knew a lot about the subject, and he brought in some of his own experiences where he had been reporting in China. And so I thought it was a really neat look at basically from the 1820s through today, and it gives some insights on why the Chinese political system is what it is and how they relate to the West. All fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I think that being in Shanghai too, sort of, it's interesting because so often, especially now, right, you either read about China from the Chinese side, or you read about China from, in our case, the American side, or broadly speaking, the West, right? Because that's sort of the great power competition that we're in now. The fascinating thing about telling the story of sort of the rise of modern China from the vantage point of Shanghai was it's sort of this third place, and it certainly was at the time, right, where it was deep in China, but also very Western. It was, very pre-modern, but also ultra-modern. It sort of jumped in a large part thanks to the families discussed in this book. So I think it really gives a good kind of bird's eye view or outsider's perspective on this, this clash that we're all, whether we want to or not, very much on the inside of right now.
Oh, absolutely. And so, all right. So as you know, this is the One Drink Book Club. So I ask people to make a cocktail inspired by the book. And I will tell you that I have a cocktail that I have researched, but this took me more research than any other one that I've done, any other podcast.
Okay.
So I'm curious to find out what you made.
So, okay, I made just a simple brandy cocktail. It's 2 ounces of brandy, 1 ounce of dry curacao, and then Peychaud's and Angostura bitters with a lemon peel twist. I used cognac because I don't have brandy. I only like brandy in cocktails, and I have this one bottle of cognac that I use. The reason I made this though was because the cocktail that I was going to make was the Cobra's Kiss, which they mention in the book, and it is a cocktail that Victor Sassoon, who we'll talk about later, invented at one of his hotels, and that is equal parts brandy, cognac, and heavy cream. And I thought I really thought about it, but I do not have the best history with cream in alcoholic beverages, and I didn't want it to impair my performance. So I decided to dial it a step back and make functionally the Cobra's Kiss minus the dairy.
Well, does anyone react well to dairy in alcoholic drinks? I just don't. I think it's a bad idea overall. Well, okay, so that's interesting. I did a lot of Googling about, so Victor Sassoon, who is one of the main characters in this, he was responsible for a huge real estate empire in Shanghai. He was part of the Sassoon family. There's 2 families in the book. the Sassoons and the Kadoris. And one of the things, as you mentioned, Victor Sassoon had this hotel, which is now, it was the Cathay Hotel. It's now the Peace Hotel. It still exists. It's owned by Fairmont now, or at least run by Fairmont. And beautiful Art Deco hotel. And it was a kind of the roaring 20s, 30s time of decadence. And I found an old menu online that talked about a couple of drinks. And another drink that Victor Sassoon liked was called the Conte Verde. And I believe it or not, I had to go deep in the liquor cabinet to have these ingredients, but I actually had them. But this one is 2 parts gin, 2 parts Cointreau, 2 parts French vermouth, 2 parts creme de menthe, and 1 part lemon. So I actually compiled all of those ingredients, and I looked at them and thought, this is going to taste horrible. There is no way that I want to drink this. So there was another one on the menu called a San Remo. So we both had the same thing where we're looking at the creme de menthe. I mean, I may as well just pour a glass of scope and drink it. But the San Remo, which was another one, is 1.5 ounces of sweet vermouth, 1 ounce of elderflower liqueur, which Saint Germain, if you are looking for a brand, 1 ounce of orange juice, 1 ounce of Campari, half an ounce of bourbon, and half a lime. So this is it's kind of this red. It almost looks like a tequila sunrise.
Cheers.
Cheers! But
How's
it's
yours? Mine's very good. Very surprisingly refreshing.
yes, mine is too. Is for as boozy as it is.
Yeah.
It's good. And I'm going to do a plug. This is a unfunded plug, but I have this. I'm a big fan of shaken drinks,
Okay.
and I have this elevated craft shaker, which is like a double walled. It's got a screw top. It doesn't get stuck.
Okay.
It has a strainer in it, and then the cap actually has lines in the metal, so you can actually use it as a measuring thing. So I'm a big fan of the elevated
I
craft
might get.
shaker.
I'm always on the hunt for more, bar gear, and my shaker is very pretty. It's a very lovely brass shaker that was a wedding gift, but it's not double vented or double walled, and so if you shake it the proper amount of times, you get frostbite on at least one of your hands. So you either have to compromise how many shakes you want to do, or you lose function of some of your digits.
Yes, I've had the same thing, and they also lock where you can't get them
You gotta
undone, and
make
you're
a
like
clutch bottle.
banging it. And I always think I'm gonna like break the granite by doing that. Um, so one of the things, for those that want to not have any spoilers, not that the true stories are a little bit hard to have a spoiler, but if I mean, I think we both agree this was a great book. So it's not too long. It's not dry at all. It's very it ends, most some of the main characters died in the 60s. One of Lawrence Kadori died in 1993. So these families are still relevant to today's business. So definitely recommend checking this out. But I'm excited to talk about some of the aspects of these families and how they got there. And one of the things I thought was really interesting was both of these families were Jewish families that started out in Baghdad. Again, I had no idea there was kind of this community of Baghdad Jews that went back 800 years. I mean, they were there for a very long time. Did you know anything about this?
I knew a little bit about it, not about the Baghdadi Jews specifically, but I know a little bit about Middle Eastern Jews. So there's in the Jewish community, right? In the diaspora community, there's Ashkenazi Jews, which is Eastern European. Sephardic is generally sort of like kind of like they were like the Spanish, like North African diaspora. I might be getting that wrong, but basically like the European diaspora. And then Mizrahi Jews, the Mizrahim, are the kind of it's Middle Eastern Persian Jews, and so that's sort of this kind of the third less discussed population of the diaspora. And then breaking it down further, I don't know if you saw a couple years ago when the Afghanistan fell again to the Taliban, there were these stories of the last Jew in Afghanistan. There was like one guy, and he had been, the sort of he kind of caught like the waves of history where like Jews had been persecuted, but then it had stopped and a lot of them fled. But he was the one there because there was one synagogue left, and he wanted to man it. And he only left for Israel when the Taliban was encroaching once again. So I knew kind of that the population that I knew more of, and this is probably a subject that's worth a book in and of itself, are the Ethiopian Jews. Which I don't know if you've heard,
I have heard of
yeah.
them. I have
So
heard of
back
them.
in the late 70s or 80s, under Menachem Begin, Israel airlifted pretty much all of Ethiopia's Jewish population to Israel because the Ethiopian government was persecuting them, and there was this big debate in Israel about whether or not these people were Jews because they had no contact with the diaspora. They practice pre-rabbinic Judaism. So like they have the Torah, but not the Talmud.
Oh,
They
interesting.
have the scriptures, but then they also follow all of these kind of Ethiopian folk customs. And there was this whole debate. And I looked this up prepping for this. I did not know this at the time, but I knew that there was eventually a decision. There was a rabbinical decision where some rabbi in Israel said, yes, they're Jews. They practice an ancient form of Judaism, and they can come. And that it was the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel who was an Iraqi Jew. So I was trying to get my facts straight on that when I was prepping for this, and I was like, and it came full circle. So yeah, I'm sort of fascinated by this. I spent a couple of weeks in Israel a few years ago, and this was kind of the both Christian and Jewish communities that you would never, that we as kind of, or I at least as a Western Italian Catholic had never thought of. Was I just kind of sort of fascinating. It's kind of these people out of time. They're kind of really just like they've been worshiping the same way and living the same way for thousands of years, and I think it's kind of fascinating.
Oh yeah, and one of the Sassoon that left Baghdad in the 1700s. So it was like mid 1700s, and ended up going to Bombay and becoming a very successful merchant there, trader there, but always had an affection for the British Crown and wanted to become a British citizen. Um, that he never didn't dress like a Baghdad sultan almost. I looked up old pictures of David Sassoon, and his sons were he allowed them to dress like a Westerner, but here this guy was practically a billionaire, and he never learned English. He did become an English citizen, was super influential, and kind of lived and dressed like he was still in Baghdad.
Yeah, it's I when I was reading about David Sassoon, those early chapters, I kept thinking about. I don't know if you watched Bridgerton. My wife and I watched
Um,
Bridgerton. Right, it's this sort of send up of Edwardian England, but the kind of central conceit is that it's in this alternate history where racial equality was more or less struck in England, right? And it's you have these people, you have nobles that are Indian, African, Asian, kind of walking around in traditional dress, and it's obviously this sort of modern ahistorical invention that's supposed to, look what it could have been, right? We all just get along, and I kept reading it, and I was like, someone should make this movie because this is like, it's not imagined. We don't have to pretend that Queen Victoria was actually, West African. We have this guy was truly walking around dealing with the Dutch East India Company, doing business in London, and truly in these huge turbans with the feathers and whatnot. And I was fascinated that like this is a real person that existed way more recently than it seems like he should have, right? Like around the time past the American Civil War. Like
Absolutely. And he was so interesting in that as a family, they understood both business and trading and were hard workers, but they also saw opportunities and they realized, hey, we need to get in with these people. Some of his sons became friends with the upcoming queen or king. They kind of ingratiated themselves in the nobility and the aristocrats in England, and really forged a lot of influence. And so it was fascinating how they did both from the trading side as well as from the social side, really grew in both influence and in wealth, and saw where other people were missing opportunities. And so they did a lot of trade in India on textiles. They had their own mills in India. They benefited from the Civil War, or not the Civil War. Yeah, actually, the Civil War in the United States because textiles went down. The South wasn't able to produce as much cotton, so they took the slack. So I thought it was really interesting, and I think both of these families, the Kadoris, who basically learned from the Sassoons, they actually worked for them, as well as the Sassoons, were masters at seeing change and then adapting to it and seeing opportunities. Um, and so the thing that I thought was interesting, I wanted to get your take on, is clearly the Sassoons, more so than the Kadoris, made a bulk of their wealth from the opium trade. And so, how does that taint their history overall?
So I have kind of a cop out answer to this question, which is that I mean, obviously it does, right? On the one hand, it does, but I think on the other hand, it doesn't, or it does, but it shouldn't, maybe, because reading about the opium wars and the opium trade, right, and the sort of the opening, the spheres of influence, the opening of China and Japan, for that matter, that's not discussed in this book. It really, if you read a description of what China, of what Shanghai, of what Japan were like before the Western countries kind of forced their opening in the 19th century, and you were asked to guess a year, if you didn't know the year attached to it, you would say 1492, 1500. Like the fact that it was, Franklin Pierce and Millard Fillmore were the American presidents that were, pushing the American, the naval forces that went to open Japan and China. It's it's almost, I used this word before, but it's almost pre-modern, even though it wasn't. And so this doesn't excuse anything, but I think that I don't. It really, when we talk today about sort of,
Mhm.
you know Orientalism, right? We talk about that as a, kind of Western people that see Southeast Asia, or the kind of the East broadly, as this mysterious, dark, savage other. We're referring to this period of time where, like, the Orient really, like,
Right.
we didn't know. Very few people had been there, right?
Yeah.
It just kind of had always existed that way. And I'm sure that some people, had uh, very done up 19th century racial notions of why it was okay to get these people addicted to opium. But I think, and from what Kaufman reports, it really just seemed that the Sassoons just sort of, this was a thing that happened, right? The opium trade in China was a thing in the same way that tea merchants were a thing in Europe, and cotton merchants were a thing in the United States. And much like in those places with the triangle trade and the slave trade, like, the systems propping them up might not have been good, but like it was the economy. So I think, like, obviously it taints them as much as any of this stuff taints anyone that was making money at the time.
Well, I think yes, in some ways, but I feel like there's some real parallels to the Sacklers, for example, with Purdue Pharma and the opioids. Here, the Sacklers did a lot of philanthropy. They did a lot of good things, but does that absolve them from, creating a country of addicts, or at least contributing to a country of addicts?
Yeah, I think the Sackler comparison is interesting. I think I don't have a strong or a concise case to make here, but it seems to me, and I'll think more about this, but it seems to me that there is something worse about the Sacklers and the opioid crisis too, right? It is the Sacklers, yes, but it's also, there are a lot of contributing factors, right? There's prescribing doctors, and all sorts. There, you look into it, and every time you think you can point to who a true villain is, someone else comes up, and a lot of it is people that are well intentioned,
Sure.
which you probably can't say about the opium war. All that being said, to me, it strikes me as worse, and maybe this is my presentism bias, but it strikes me as worse that in the 90s and the early 2000s, amidst all we know about pharmacology and addiction and science and medicine and all this stuff, it strikes me as that they have a little bit more culpability, right? They have a little bit more, and again, that's probably just because this is what we're living through. And if you plucked a Shanghai resident in 1855, would probably say that the Sassoon family and the Dutch East India Company, they could make the same, in our age of enlightenment, how could,
Yes,
you
right.
know, continue to push the poppy on us? I'm sure that's a thing, but to my modern ears at least, it's, I don't know, it seems so far in the past for me that I'm more willing to kind of take it as a function of the times.
Sure. I thought, I hadn't thought about the spheres of influence since probably sophomore year in high school. There was a part of the history book for world history that talked about it. But I mean, it really was incredible that, you have these sections of China where the Americans were in control, or the British were in control, or the French were in control, and they literally did not have to abide to any Chinese laws. Any crime that happened in there was regulated by Britain or America or France. They had no culpability with anything local. I mean, it was like diplomacy, the diplomats here in DC, but, they get out of their parking tickets. But beyond that,
Yeah,
they have to like play by the rules. This was out of control. And they go on to talk about how the Chinese government and the Chinese economy often talks about the 100 years humiliation, and they never want to repeat it, and they keep drumming it into the heads. But I get it. After you see how they were just really in their own country treated like second class citizens, as these people kind of came in and made these deals that they didn't have any choice with. They said, we're going to do it the way we want to do it, and we'll do whatever we want.
yeah, no, the extraterritoriality, which I think is what they called it, was is you can't. It's like you start thinking about it too much, and it's kind of like a divide by zero error in your head. It doesn't make sense, and this is part of why I think um, the Sassoon's involvement in the opium trade kind of stings less relative to some of the other good contributions that they've made for me, because it's like that's the perfect example of how this really was kind of a world beyond our comprehension. The thing that I kept thinking of is, and I think about this a lot, is, think about the Industrial Revolution, or think about, sort of even through kind of mid-century America, right? To us, it seems crazy. Say what you will of, everyone can debate the climate change and environment and, the various strictures of that, but it seems crazy to think that there was a time when people genuinely thought, let's just take all this garbage and toxic stuff and let's either burn it or put it in the ocean. And you know what? It's probably going to have no effect. Like, I'm not saying that I'm not a climate alarmist, but it seems just so intuitive. It seems self-evident that of course this is going to do something, and probably not something good, right? The fact that there was a time when people didn't know that, when people didn't think that way, the fact that there was a time when some people thought, yeah, we can just, we'll talk to England. We don't need to include China. And we'll just carve out little slivers and we can do whatever we want there. There's no crime. That is insane. Like, no
Bonkers.
modern government would think that way. It's so again, it's sort of, yeah, it's, I totally understand the 100 years humiliation. I also would not want to endure that again. But for us, looking back at it from a historical vantage point, I do think that those are the sort of things where it's like, it's easy to condemn, just say that was bad. But it's more interesting to think through, like, what was going on that made this happen? Like, what were what was that world really like? And I think Kaufman does a good job of that, of not necessarily praising or condemning these things, but just putting us on the ground. This is what it was like, and that's I think what makes it such a great book.
I agree, and it's interesting. I think they justified it obviously in a lot of different ways. They considered themselves more civilized, and I'm using air quotes with civilized, and they just had the technological prowess and the basically the manpower and the gunpowder, that they just they did whatever they want. They were so superior in military might that China didn't really have a choice. And so I think you see that in a lot of situations uh, throughout history, that if somebody has an advantage that's a notable advantage from a military standpoint, they will culturally dominate everything that they're up against. I mean, Genghis Khan did that. The horsemen of Genghis Khan were so far advanced than the other countries that they were going up against, that it wasn't even a fair fight.
Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the things I think, I mean, the book talks about this early history. They talk about the later history, but for me, the real meat was that like 20s, 30s, 40s, where it's Victor Sassoon is kind of the most dominant Sassoon. Um, Eli Kadori, who is the other kind of rival Jewish family. Not that they're rivals so much that they were fighting, but that they both were big in business, big in real estate, big in trading, big in Shanghai. But it's got this allure because it's kind of this golden age, the Art Deco buildings, the fancy hotels. There's a glamour to it, where Shanghai kind of was the up and coming glamorous town, which was really neat to me.
Yeah, it's there's something about the the cosmopolitan city, um, which I think is what you get a lot of in this book. That we don't, kind of paradoxically, we get less and less the more globalized we become, because everything is so interconnected now, that kind of everywhere. I mean, to take this the most extreme way, everything is international, but every city is international in the sense of there are, you go to New York, right? Queens has more Puerto Ricans than in Puerto Rico and more Jews than Israel. And, it's these, like, literally an international city. But back in the 20s and the 30s, right, you had these kind of cosmopolitan hubs, London, Shanghai, Paris, right? These places where there was a class, right? There was it was the precursor of the jet set, right? But it was these the wealthy, the rich, the famous, the intelligentsia, the revolutionaries, and they would travel the world and go to places like this. And it was, again, it was so specific because so much of the world was so provincial or localized that it does. You're right. It gives this kind of this impossibly glamorous allure to these places that I think we're especially drawn to now, because it was a time when interconnectedness was really truly something special, instead of just the common, right, workaday.
Yeah. Well, I've talked about that a number of times throughout the years. Every city, if in the United States, there are few places that are truly unique anymore. If you go to Dallas or Columbus or Denver, there aren't a lot in terms of buildings and architecture and stores. I mean, you're going to have the same restaurants and the same chain stores. I feel like Las Vegas, New Orleans, those are kind of our unique. San Francisco have these kind of unique personalities, unique feels to them. But so much of America and the world at this point is becoming homogeneous in the way that it looks, and that's a shame. And I think you're right that Shanghai was really unique at the time, and due to a lot going to the Sassoons and the Kadoris for all their building. I mean, it was the real estate ventures that they did. And one of the things I thought was really neat, both families had these very high end hotels that were catered to that jet set crowd. And the Sassoons had the Cathay Hotel, and the Kadoris had the Majestic Hotel. And I thought, I mean, did you look up any of the photos of those hotels?
I did, and I'm like it seems you are. I'm a sucker for the old Art Deco buildings, so I too like this is it's incredible. They're really something to behold.
Well, and I'll try to put some maybe in the video version of this podcast to show they're all in this area called the Bund, which was the international portion of Shanghai. And when it was after the Opium Wars, this area was basically patrolled by the British Army. I mean, it was its own little section of the city, and these massive Art Deco buildings, and the cafe hotel that Victor Sassoon built is still in existence today. The Majestic, I don't know if you noticed this in the book. I actually went back and was kind of rereading sections before tonight, and the Majestic Hotel was an equally fancy hotel. It had this ballroom that would hold more than 1,000 people. Chiang Kai-shek had his marriage in that ballroom, and that hotel only existed, it was opened in 1924 and was torn down in 1932. I
Oh
mean, can
wow,
you imagine?
I didn't really pick up on that. I remember that Chiang Kai Shek got rid of it. I
Yeah,
did not the timing. Yeah, wow.
and I don't know whether it was they overbuilt, or that because Victor Sassoon's hotel opened in 1929, did they just put them out of business? They were the new fanciest thing on the block, but to literally have it torn down in
Yeah,
less than 10 years is crazy.
that's wild. Yeah, it's there's some, I thinking through this and reading this. I think it's there's hotels, it's sort of kind of what part and parcel with what I said earlier about sort of the way that globalization has kind of cannibalized the cosmopolitan. But as I was thinking through this, I noticed that a lot of like the best books that I've read in the past few years have been about hotels, the type of hotel that doesn't exist. Nonfiction, Last Call, the Hotel Imperial is a phenomenal book about a hotel in I think Germany, where the journalists, the American and British journalists between the world wars, kind of coalesced and came together and realized that there was something rotten in the state of Deutschland. Gentleman in Moscow, which I believe you've read, the
Oh
Emil
yeah.
Towns novel, which is about a kind of a grand hotel in an old imperial Russian hotel through the Soviet era, the Grand Budapest Hotel, the great Wes Anderson movie. And I was sort of thinking through these things because like, man, I love stories, true or not true, book or movie, about these kind of old hotels, and it's not like an interest of mine. Like I don't know anything about the construction or management of these hotels, but I'm sort of drawn to and always appreciate a story taking place in them and about them. And I do think that again, it's sort of like it's kind of got one foot in each side, right? Where it's like on the one, it's like, yeah, obviously I get this. It's a hotel. We've all been to hotels. We all know what it's like to travel, to stay somewhere, to travel somewhere new, to see interesting people in the lobby at the bar. But of course, like the hotels we go to today are not the hotels that we're talking about. So it's sort of like it's accessible enough where you can picture yourself there. And then once you're there, it really transports you back to this different age. And I think it's sort of I don't know. I feel like we're in the age of Airbnb. Maybe we're due for
A revival.
well, yeah, a reappreciation of the old hotels.
Well, the author Kaufman talks a little bit about how the hotels at the time were kind of an oasis of British aristocracy. And so you'd have these hotels, and they were very important, especially in these kind of far flung places like Shanghai, where you could go and you could have a fine cigar and your cognac, and it was going to be very much like you would experience in London or in Paris. And so these were kind of a place where people could feel like they were at home, but at home for a very upper crust, first
Right.
class kind of existence. And I've thought about it. At one point, I thought, well, geez, I would add this to my list of the Metropole Hotel in Moscow, in Gentlemen in Moscow, and the it's now called the Peace Hotel in Shanghai. It would be a fun tour to go to these places that really are characters in these books, whether it's fiction or nonfiction.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe one. But that's we'll do that. That would be a great tour and maybe a different age. The Moscow for a couple of weeks and then Shanghai for another. That wouldn't arouse any suspicions for anybody.
No,
You know, that
no,
would be
no. Yeah, maybe not today. We can take our Zeppelin
yeah,
from
that's right.
spot to
Yeah,
spot.
we'll just hop on the Orient Express. Nothing bad has ever happened there. It'll be great.
Uh, well, so one of the parts of this book that is really interesting is uh, the role that both the Sassoons and Kadoris played in Shanghai uh, at the lead up to World War II, sheltering Jews of Europe. So, talk a little bit about what happened there and what role those families had in this really interesting time and really desperate time for European Jews.
Yeah, so I mean, this is sort of kind of one of the more shameful areas of history for most countries and peoples in the world because you read these horrible stories about we the West, America, Europe, England, Franklin Roosevelt, like people knew that the Holocaust, or at least that the pogroms were happening earlier than we like to remember that they were happening. And you read these terrible stories of ocean liners full of Jews departing Germany, departing Poland, and going from port to port, and countries turning them away, and eventually them getting sent back to Nazi occupied territory, and sort of being sent to the concentration camps. And it's sort of these heartbreaking stories. This fortunately was the one, like the maybe one of the only instances en masse where that did not happen. And so it was sort of the perfect. You mentioned before that they were competitors but not competitors, and they were kind of like friendly competitors that really did. It was like the Beatles and the Stones, right? Like obviously competitive, but also pushing each other to be better, to innovate more. And so Ellie Kadori, who was the pater familias of the second family, right? The ones that he was originally a Sassoon employee. He went to Victor Sassoon and said something along the lines of, "It's a war. You're a Sassoon. Stop being a playboy and do something about this." And so Victor Sassoon started raising money. He enlisted celebrities like Charlie Chaplin to raise money for sort of the cause of the Jewish refugees. He also negotiated with the imperial Japanese officers that were occupying Shanghai, who at first Japan had not yet entered the Axis powers, but they were occupying China. So this happened separately. And he kind of, distracted him, sort of, they were getting pressure. They wanted to enter the Axis power. So they're like, we don't really want to bring in that many Jews. Like, that's not gonna impress our buddies in Munich. But he sort of kind of talked his way out of it and bribed it and did a little misdirection. And they eventually, I think on order of 150,000 Jews from all across Europe eventually made their way to Shanghai. And not only did they shelter them, or did they bring them there, but then the Kadoris built a school to educate the children. And it was like, from, I'm sure that, conditions were hard, but they made it a good faith effort they taught them music and art and literature and fed them. Like, it was a lot of them. They were overcrowded. They were constantly struggling to keep up, but it wasn't just like it didn't stop once the refugees got there. And then once the war really, after Pearl Harbor, after the Japanese entered the Axis powers, once things really, kicked into gear, the Kadoris and the Sassoons worked to keep the Jewish refugees that they had sheltered safe. The Nazis were putting pressure on the Imperial Japanese. They wanted to say, they suggested just put them all on a barge and sink it in the middle of the ocean. They were like, just get rid of them. That's sort of our aim here. And even as the Kadoris and the Sassoons were having their buildings occupied, even as they were, some of them getting round up and sent to occupied POW camps, they managed to sort of protect as best they could these populations. And I agree. I thought that was a staggering story that is something that should be like make that movie, right? That's something that we should all know more about.
Oh yeah, and I thought one of the real heroes was a guy who was, I think, in the Austrian Chinese embassy. So he was in the Chinese embassy. He was a Chinese bureaucrat or statesman, but relatively low level. And at the time, Shanghai was one of the few places where you didn't need a visa to enter. And so all over Europe, Jews needed to get visas to get out of Germany, to get out of some of these countries. And if you couldn't get a visa, nobody would let you onto a ship to leave. And so this guy in the Chinese embassy realized that even though you didn't need a visa to get into Shanghai, he could create a visa which would then allow a family or a person to get out of Europe. And so he himself, I think, gave 3,000 visas out to people, which are, it's kind of like giving out monopoly money, because you didn't need one of these, but you didn't need one to get into Shanghai, but you needed one to get out of Europe. And nobody told him to do it. Nobody said, gave him permission, but he took it upon himself and saved thousands of people. Really an unsung hero.
Yeah, no, it's sort of, again, it's kind of, it's kind of, you can't even use, it's a stunning story to read. It's really, it's like, you think about even Casablanca, right, which obviously is a fictional account, but you think about, right, in that movie, there's people waiting and waiting to just get these exits, to get out. That was the craziest thing, right? It was 2 layers. You had to get out first, and then you had to get in somewhere else. And for a lot of people, the best case scenario was you only checked the first box, you only got out, but then you were waiting. Where I mean,
Yeah,
a
you
lot of
were
Jewish
basically
refugees wound
limbo.
up in what is now Israel, and that that was there was a lot of conflict there because that was the sort of they were the kind of nascent uh, kibbutzes in the Middle East, but so a lot of them ended up there. That obviously was not they, from the second they landed there, they were immediately fighting for survival once again. So if you didn't get to America or Australia, it was you were kind of the best thing you could say about the places you ended up was that you weren't in Nazi occupied territory, and oftentimes that was only better by a slight degree. Whereas you get to Shanghai and it was uh, Michael Blumenthal, right? Bill
Yeah,
Clinton's Treasury Secretary was one of the refugees, right? I'm not
yeah,
not his, him and his
y-
parents were there,
yep,
so it's like, and he credits right. He's like, I learned math in the Kadori school. Like that's where I started to like think about the world and think about. He talks about seeing the kind of international village that's sprung up in the Bund, and he says like that's where I kind of started to think about these things. So they weren't. It wasn't just subsistence. Like they really did do. They made a good faith effort to give lives to these people after welcoming them in, and that more than even sheltering them would have been a feat in and of itself. But what they did after that, how above and beyond they went, is was an incredible story.
yeah. It and the fact that they gave these chances to all these people, kept them safe, and then were still able to, uh, thrive in their businesses and everything else was really an interesting aspect. Was there a family? They Kaufman sets it up as a rivalry, and as we said, they were rivals, but not. I mean, they ended up getting into different businesses. The Kadoris ended up getting into energy and power. The Sassoons, obviously had their opium for a long time, but then they were also doing textiles, and then real estate in Shanghai. Was there a favorite for you? Did you like the Kadoris? Were you team Kadori or uh, team Sassoon?
I was Team Kadori because I'm a sucker for like a nouveau riche startup, and as funny as it is, because now that they're both these multi-billion-dollar conglomerate families, the Kadoris were in this instance the startup. So I love a good rags to riches story, but also, joking aside, because of that, right? The Sassoon family, as you see at the beginning of the book, they were the bankers to the sultans or whatever the ruling class was in Baghdad. Whoever, I forget his name, but whoever the first Sassoon of the dynasty, he was a billionaire before the American Revolution. So when David Sassoon had to flee Baghdad under, whatever political strife it was, he was an aristocrat looking for a new aristocracy and a businessman looking for a new market. And you see that with the way he raised his sons, and he dispatched them, and he told them to go far away from their wives and families and far away from each other. And they always kind of rivaled, and they were always had their eye on the ball. Whereas the Kadoris, they were a little more warm. They were a little more familial, right? Eli Kadori kept his sons close, all while maximizing a profit. But he didn't want his sons to have to leave their families. He cherished his wife, the brothers Lawrence and Horace, who were his two sons, who were the ones that were active in the World War II period, right? They were very close, even though they were very different, and they sort of divided things up. And I mean, obviously, again, as you said, this book almost reads novelistically. So as characters, the Kadoris I think are more likable and more accessible. But I also just sort of found I was kind of fascinated by the way that it really shows how you can kind of plant a seed of the family dynamic, you know, early on, and it's kind of fascinating how it's like you could tell the different personalities that different generations are going to have, just based on how it started off.
You definitely could, and I agree with you. I was kind of team Kadori as well. They were a little less ruthless and a little more friendly. Although I would say if I were living in Shanghai in the 30s, I would have loved to go to both of their parties because Victor Sassoon knew how to throw a party,
Yeah.
and the Kadoris knew how to throw a party, especially when Ellie Kadori, he had this beloved wife, everybody loved her. She was really an amazing woman, but when she died, he was kind of a bachelor, and he had these two bachelor sons. They lived in this massive mansion, and he basically was saying like, hey, let's all have fun. I mean, it was kind of like Rodney Dangerfield and Back to School. Like he was just going to have this, crazy. They were just having these crazy parties all the time,
Yeah.
and so I think it would have been fun to know both of them. But I think I would have wanted to party with Victor and then maybe hang out a little bit more with the Kadoris.
Yeah, maybe like a nice dinner with the Kadoris, right? Victor will do the Charleston, maybe drink one of these cream-based cocktails that he swears are good. But yeah, no, I certainly would have been an equal opportunity hotel guest. But if I had to lay down loyalties,
Well, and I will say that I think the Kadoris won. If you were going to have a rivalry, and the reason the Kadoris won is that they saw that communism was coming before Victor Sassoon did. And they really made their moves to move a lot of their businesses, their wealth, and their roots really to Hong Kong because they saw that Britain still owned Hong Kong. They had the long time lease on it, and they were smart in the way that they never angered the Communist Party. They worked with them to provide power to parts of China and were able to continue to be successful. Whereas basically Victor owned, they said in today's dollars, about $500 million worth of real estate in Shanghai. And when Mao went into power, uh, they took it all over. And he moved to the Bahamas. He
yeah,
lived very well there for the rest of his life, but he still lost a lot of money in the real estate market in Shanghai.
yeah. I think I mean, you mentioned having an eye on the trends, right? And the Kadoris certainly had a better eye on the trends in that sense. I think it's also because again, they the Sassoons were old school tycoons, right? They really were what they really wanted to be, which was an old money British family. And as anyone who's ever watched Downton Abbey knows, right, the old money British families did not see the changing economy coming. They assumed that because it's always been this way, it always will be this way, and that was what they put all of their faith in. And I think that imperiled both their business futures but also their legacies, right? So the Kadoris were more adaptable, I think, in their business because, as Kaufman shows, right, they were more, not only were they more family oriented, they were also more community oriented, and they were also, of the two families, the more religious, right? They were the ones that built and endowed the synagogues and the Hebrew schools. And so when you read the testimonies from people that were sort of the beneficiaries of these two families, the people that went through the Sassoon academies that they built to train their workers, those are all older accounts, right? Because those were eventually the industrial eras changed, and that mattered less. It didn't matter that you were educating your own factory foreman, but things like primary school, secondary school, Hebrew school, music school, like these are things that are perennially important, and this is how you leave a legacy, and this is something that the Kadoris understood. And it seems to me that maybe the fact that they understood that there were things in, there were important things outside of the business world probably allowed them to be a little bit more open-minded with the business landscape. Because if you had made the modern equivalent of $100 billion doing the same thing for 200 years, if that were me, I would probably think, yeah, I mean, we've made it through we made it through, we got kicked out of Baghdad, we made it through all these conflicts, all these world wars, what could possibly come next, you know
True. And between the two families, the Kadoris were the only ones that I think befriended is probably too strong a word, but worked directly with Chinese business people. And the Sassoons very much kept themselves separate, lived in this kind of international expatriate type of world, where the Kadoris had very close business associates who were Chinese merchants, Chinese business people. And I think that's what really helped them when they made the move to Hong Kong. And they also, along with the charities that you talked about with uh, the synagogues and the schools, they also provided a lot of they were the company that brought electricity to a lot of the rural areas of Hong Kong, and they were helping small farmers, families, and villages that were really far flung. And I think that bought them a lot of goodwill locally that made it a lot harder to kick them out of the country.
Yeah, and during, I mean, and as Kaufman recounts, right, there are times during the communist revolution in China during Mao's Long March and whatnot, where there are leaders in the nascent in the nascent People's Republic who see the name Kadori and remember the name from the trucks that brought gas to their remote farm villages, or the people, the uniform labels of the people that hung the power lines, uh and felt, if not gratitude, at least a softness, right? It associated them with, for all the reasons they were Western, millionaire, imperialist, bourgeoisie, whatever. They were also the people that kept the lights on. They were the people that, set up tenant farming systems that allowed my parents to make it through a famine and things like that. And that stuff always matters, but certainly in times of violent revolution.
Absolutely. Well, I think this was a fantastic book. It definitely spurred me to do a lot more research. Again, looking at photos of the old hotels, looking at history of menus at the Peace Hotel or the Cathay Hotel. And I really appreciate you taking the time to discuss it with me, and I appreciate the suggestion.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me.
Start.
Always good to talk about some great books.
And what's next on your nightstand now to read? What's on your list of to read?
I am currently reading Jamey Kirchick's Secret City: The Hidden History of Gay Washington. It is fascinating and also gripping and reads like a thriller. It's about 1,000 times as long as Kings of Shanghai, but absolutely worth it. It's you would like it. It kind of reads like a spy thriller.
Interesting.
But it's a fascinating social history. So I've been working my way through that for a while, and I'm 2 nights away from finishing it, but strong recommend.
All right. Well, that's a good one. I appreciate it. And again, thanks for being here. If you are listening, please make sure to subscribe and throw in a review if you can. And check out the website, onedrinkbookclub.com, to get the recipes for tonight's cocktails. And have a good evening and enjoy whatever you're reading.